Good afternoon from Oslo, and a warm welcome to this webinar on the responsibility to protect. My name is Anne-Catherine da Silva, and I am the Secretary General of the United Nations Association of Norway. I'm also the chair of the Committee of World Federation of United Nations Association, also called WFUNA. This autumn, we celebrate the 75th birthday of the United Nations. The UN Charter makes firm commitments for peace and human rights. But it also emphasizes respect for sovereignty and sets limits to when the UN can intervene in conflicts. As a way around this internal conflict in the UN Charter, of the concept of responsibility to protect was decided upon 15 years ago today. And I'm happy and grateful that my sister UNAs in Sweden and in Denmark took the initiative to today's event and decided also to invite us, UNA Norway.
Thank you, Anne-Kat. My name is Torleif Jonasson, and I am with the Danish UN Association. Witnessing the tragedies in Rwanda and the Balkans in the 1990s, it was apparent to us that the UN system must be better prepared to handle situations where atrocity crimes are committed. Consequently, we applauded the resolution of the responsibility to protect decided upon in 2005. And R2p has been part of the agenda of the Danish UNA since then. We have produced reports and explainers on the matter, and we maintain a dialogue with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs in support of their work. I think that my Nordic colleagues would agree that Denmark has been the most active country in Scandinavia in its support to the principles of R2p. We are also members of the Civil Society International Coalition for the R2p, as is UNA of Sweden. And later today, we will hear from the coalition's campaign coordinator, Anjali Mananganan, in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Torleif. Well, hello everybody around the world. My name is Anneli Börjesson, and as President for UNA Sweden, I complete our Nordic Troika of hosts. We too have been very active in R2p, but I think that this is the first time that we have an event with diplomats from Norway and Denmark present in the panel. With us here today are Mr. Tor Henrik Andersen from Norwegian Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Mr. Ulf Melgaard from the Danish MFA. Denmark, as Torleif mentioned, is very relevant for often referring to R2p, and Norway is especially interesting for being on the UN Security Council the 2 coming years. UNA Sweden has had the pleasure of arranging events with the UN Special Advisors on R2p several times over the years. Our intention was to welcome the current advisor, Dr. Karen Smith, to Stockholm this fall, but due to the current circumstances, we are instead delighted to greet her to this international webinar. But before we turn to Dr. Smith, a longtime friend of R2p, Mr. Jan Eliasson, who is former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and now Chair of the SIPRI Governing Board, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Mr. Eliasson has honored us by offering to give us some views on the topic and its origin. To most of us, Jan needs no introduction, but since we have attendees from all continents and ages, I would like to mention that Jan is also former Swedish Foreign Minister and former President of the UN General Assembly, notably in 2005 when the General Assembly decided upon the concept of R2p. So now it's my very great pleasure to give this virtual floor to you, Jan, please.
Thank you very much, Anneli, and thank you to you and to the Norwegian and Danish UN associations for organizing this event. I think it's very important that we are reminded not only of the responsibility to protect, but also the situation for human rights in the world and democracy in the world, and not least the situation for multilateral cooperation. I think the activities of your organizations are extremely important. And coming from the Nordic countries who have supported UN so steadfastly over the years, I think it's particularly important that you keep the information on this high level. So thank you very much. I will look back a little bit at how the concept evolved, and then I will hand over to Karen. And I was given 5 to 7 minutes. I hope I will make it. I recall very strongly and very vividly the moment when I gavelled the resolution, or rather the document in the summit document, where this was contained in Articles 138 and 139, responsibility to protect. I will come back to the labors and the troubles we went through to get it into that summit document. But it was quite an important ordeal, and I felt tremendous joy at getting this done and having it now standing there as an agenda on the UN agenda for, I hope, for the future also. The background is, of course, the genocides that occurred in Cambodia and Rwanda and Srebrenica, and similar situations of mass atrocities over the last 40, 50 years, where, of course, we have the Genocide Convention, but there was a need, we felt, many of us, that there was a need for some political momentum and energy, political energy added to the Genocide Convention. And therefore, we were planning to move on this issue in the 90s. The initiative came very strongly from the Canadian and Australian side. The Foreign Minister of Canada, Lloyd Axworthy, took the initiative to a commission, and they worked out together the ideas of sovereignty, which were almost, I would say, revolutionary, because they turned around the criticism of the initiative as it was discussed earlier, for lacking in respect of sovereignty. But Gareth Evans and Mohamed Sanoun from Australia, respectively Algeria, chaired this commission, and I talked to them over those months and years that this discussion went on. And it was so interesting how they turned around the discussion, saying that, well, if sovereignty is so important, wouldn't you accept the responsibility of leaders for the safety of their own populations? Don't you have some type of responsibility to protect your own population? It was hard to say no to that question, as you understand. And politically, it was so smart to move this to rather enhancing the concept of sovereignty, that it includes a responsibility for the safety and security of your own population. So it was brought into the discussion, and they produced the results of their commission in 2001. And Jens Peterson reminded me of the date, around the 20th of June, 2001. It was just after 9/11, by the way. And it was then picked up later. It was there all the time being discussed, also on the diplomatic levels in the UN. But when Kofi Annan set up his commission, which later came out with the report, In Larger Freedom, he included the concept of responsibility to protect. And it was delivered in the spring of 2005. I was then starting to prepare for the presidency of the General Assembly. And I joined Jean Ping, my predecessor, in New York in June 2005. And one of the first tasks that were given to me by Jean Ping, because I was incoming president, was to work with the two concepts, terrorism on the one hand and R2p on the other. It was a rather masochistic exercise, as you understand. We were discussing this issue in rooms in the basement of the UN with no air conditioning in August, can you imagine? And we worked with some of the reluctant parties very, very actively and very strongly. I can say very openly that there was skepticism coming from Russia, from China, from some of the G77 countries, India, Brazil, Egypt, I recall. And I remember bilateral discussions with the ambassadors, who in their turn were in contact with their governments, to make them understand that this concept had to be adopted, because we wanted to avoid to come into a situation of not saying never again. Can you imagine the humiliation to always say never again after every genocide? I remember myself trying to convince people in the most awkward situations, the most awkward being an ambassador. I almost said the name of the country. And I remember trying to convince him in an elevator to the top of the building. I think we went up and down 3 times before he finally conceded. So it was adopted and became part of the summit document. I'm not too proud of the long sentences in those paragraphs. They are, with all reservations, you see them all there. I'm very glad we squeezed in the concept of prevention, and that we should try to build on even more. But I think when it came to the operational part of who would in the end be responsible for possible measures against a leadership which did not accept the responsibility to protect, then of course we had to land in the Security Council. And that is both the strength and the weakness of the concept, that it has you lay the responsibility on the Security Council. On the other hand, we all know the difficulty of the vetoes and the many of the conflicts which are due to, or risks very easily becoming a competition between major powers. And especially today, and even a few years back, when the mistrust is so deep between the parties, it's hard to get the operational responsibility translated to action in the field. It was also made more difficult by the use of the R2p concept in the Libya conflict, because there, Russia and China in particular, but also some others in the G77 group, felt that it was not meant to be leading to regime change. And there was a fear that in the future it was going to be used with a humanitarian cover for actually desire to make regime change. So it hasn't been applied as much as I had hoped. Karen will come back to this, I'm sure. I'm glad it was brought up in the 2014 when we recalled the 10-year markings of the Rwanda genocide. But in my view, it needs to be referred to more often in resolutions on anything related to conflict resolution and all the issues that are on the agenda. You can always find an angle, I think, to bring it in and make references to it, and not least to use it in the preventive purposes that is also mentioned, because the 3 chapters mentioned in the resolution is chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which is peaceful settlement disputes, chapter 7, which is using forceful means, and chapter 8, which is regional cooperation. So you have a tremendous potential still in the R2p, and I'm extremely glad that you as UNAs and the people who listen in on this conversation will, after this conversation, hopefully run with the baton and strengthen this concept even further. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan, for sharing your experiences and this information with us. Next, I would like to introduce a colleague of mine who will facilitate this webinar. From UNA Sweden, Mr. Jens Peterson, Senior Advisor on Peace and Security. Please, Jens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anneli, and I will soon give the floor to our keynote speaker. But first, I would like to thank the audience for being here and invite you to take an active role in forming what we will discuss. You can do so by using the Q&A function. For most of you, located at the bottom of your screen, if you move your cursor down there. Try to write a short version of your question, and if you are directing it to a specific speaker, please indicate so. We may choose to read out your question, or we may choose to let you ask it on camera yourself. You can also pose a written question anonymously in the Q&A function. We are recording this event for possible future broadcast, so if you do not want to be on camera or have your name in the records, please say so. You will have to bear with us that the competition on questions may be high. This morning we were over 300 persons registered to attend this event from 41 different countries, and I see now that we are at some somewhere around 250 persons present. Also worth noting is that it will be hard for the panel to discuss details on specific conflicts, but some conflicts we might be able to turn into thematic discussions. After these instructions, I turn to our headline speaker. UNA Sweden has, as Anneli said, been fortunate to interact with several of the United Nations Secretary General Special Advisors on the responsibility to protect. And as a good substitute to bringing Dr. Karen Smith to Stockholm, we are happy to bring her to this digital and global event. Dr. Karen Smith is a South African citizen and holds a PhD from the University of Stellenbosch. Currently, however, she gives lectures on international relations at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And since the beginning of 2019, she acts as Antonio Guterres' special advisor on these issues. A warm welcome to Karen Smith. Our screens are yours.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to first thank UNA Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, and especially Jens for organizing this important event and for inviting me to be part of it. And I'm really sorry that I can't be in Stockholm right now, because in fact, in 2005, I was on a 1-month visiting professorship in Stockholm. So it would have been a nice reunion of sorts as well. And I'm particularly grateful that this event is being organized by UNAs, because of course I also was involved with the South African United Nations Association also around 2005, 2006. So this is something that is very close to my heart. Now, I would like to start off by saying that the fact that we continue to see atrocity crimes happening and the Security Council doing very little about it has led many people to say that the principle of the responsibility to protect has failed. Now, unfortunately, many people judge the successes, or perhaps more importantly, the failures of the responsibility to protect based on how often the Security Council has authorized military intervention in the name of the principle. Now, this is a number of implications, and I want to highlight 4 of them. The first is that the persistent misconception that the responsibility to protect is all about military intervention is reinforced. The second is that by focusing on the role of the Security Council, the responsibility to protect is framed as only a peace and security issue rather than also a human rights issue. Thirdly, it shifts our attention away from the fact that the responsibility to protect is first and foremost, as Jan Eliasson has pointed out, about prevention. And fourthly, it frames the responsibility to protect as a foreign policy issue. So I want to look very briefly at each of these. So to the first point, that R2p is about military intervention. Now, the UN Charter sets out a range of options, both specific and coercive, that states can employ in responding to atrocity crimes, with the very last resort being military action, and only if approved by a Security Council resolution. Now, as we've already heard, this option has not been used very often, and yet when it has, as was the case in Libya, it is then regarded as evidence of R2p's failure as a principle. I think we should rather regard this as an implementation problem rather than a problem of the principle itself. If we think about the responsibility to protect, it's a relatively young principle. Some people call it an emerging norm that I think still requires some development. And so paragraphs 138 and 139 of the World Outcome Summit document, even though they're long sentences, as we've heard, actually contain very little detail about how R2p is to be implemented in practice. And so while I want to underline that the principle itself should be uncontested, there is scope for deliberation, especially around questions of implementation. Now, following the Libyan intervention, the Brazilian initiative, which some of you might be familiar with, called Responsibility While Protecting, was one such innovation that unfortunately was not embraced by the international community as a whole. So instead of seeing Libya as a failure of the principle itself, Responsibility While Protecting asked us to consider improvements in order to avoid the mistakes made in Libya in the future. And this included, for example, addressing perceptions of misuse by developing criteria for the use of military force, and also for holding the Security Council accountable when they authorize the use of force. And this leads me to the second and third points that I want to address together. The second being that by focusing on the role of the Security Council, R2p is framed only as a peace and security issue rather than also a human rights issue. And thirdly, that this shifts our attention away from the focus on prevention. Now, we all know that prevention is not newsworthy. So the examples of where atrocity crimes have been averted are not generally discussed. But every government, every civil society organization that is involved in building stronger, resilient societies, strengthening the rule of law, protecting human rights, working towards economic inequality, is ultimately engaged in atrocity prevention. By their very nature, atrocity crimes constitute the most serious human rights violations. And this responsibility to protect has its roots in existing international humanitarian and human rights law. As we've witnessed in practice, serious human rights violations are often the precursors to the commission of atrocity crimes. And so by addressing early patterns of human rights violations, we can limit the risk of further violations and ultimately also the commission of atrocity crimes. If all states were to do this and to fulfill their obligations under what has become known as Pillar 1, we would never have to get to the stage where we need to discuss R2p's so-called Pillar 3, where more coercive measures are needed to protect populations from atrocity crimes because their governments have manifestly failed to do so. And here the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms, but also all civil society organizations involved in human rights work have a crucial role to play. This also leads me to the point that in thinking about the future of the responsibility to protect, we need to consider the role that other parts of the UN besides the Security Council can play, including the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. But we also need to look beyond the UN. Over the past few years, we've seen regional and sub-regional organizations play an increasingly important role in preventing and responding to the threat of atrocity crimes. These should not be seen as replacing global efforts, but of course there are advantages, including that regional organizations are often better placed to take early action, and this should be encouraged. And here, ECOWAS as a sub-regional organization in Africa stands out. I always like to use the example of the Gambia's constitutional crisis in 2017 as an example of effective atrocity prevention. It's a case which many of you might not be familiar with for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that is that prevention does not make the news. And I'd encourage you to go and look at that example because it is also one where we see the benefits of collaboration, where ECOWAS was working with the African Union, with the Security Council, with the European Union, and with important states in the region. Now, as I said, civil society organizations are equally important. We sometimes get stuck in a bit of a state-centric discourse when we talk about the responsibility to protect. And this, of course, includes the work of UNAs in awareness raising and the work of NGOs on the ground who are best placed to provide early warning. And I'm happy to see that Angie will be speaking afterwards as she's very much involved in this work as well. We've also seen increased attention being paid to corporate actors, for example, social media companies, and their responsibility to address hate speech and incitement of violence on their platforms. I also want to briefly just mention the importance of addressing impunity and holding perpetrators accountable for their crimes, as relevant not only in terms of providing justice for victims, but also as essential to preventing recurrence. Linked to this, we need to recognize and address the early risk signs, not only in other countries, but also in our own. This perception that is held by many states that the responsibility to protect is only a foreign policy issue serves to reinforce the criticism that it is an agenda of Western states to intervene in the nations of the global South and to bring about regime change. Instead, if we are serious about prevention, it starts at home. And the responsibility to protect is first and foremost an issue of domestic policy. All societies are potentially vulnerable, and there's no country in the world where some of the risk factors cannot be identified. And so I'd like to call especially on the supporters of R2p to lead by example. Throughout the world, including the USA and Europe, we're witnessing a surge in anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, attacks against Christians, and intolerance targeting various other groups based simply on their identity. We see rising nationalist sentiments, which are often expressed through hate speech that targets vulnerable minority groups and refugees. And I want to emphasize this last point because we sometimes overlook that in paragraph 138 of the World Outcome Summit document, states committed themselves to protecting their populations, not just their citizens, from the 4 crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and also from their incitement. So all states really have a responsibility to strengthen societal resilience against future threats of violence, which includes addressing hate speech and incitement to violence. Ultimately, what the United Nations, regional organizations, states, and civil society organizations should be doing is making sure that in whatever work they do, the prevention of atrocity crimes is considered. For example, asking what might the implications of development assistance to a particular country be with regards to impacting on economic inequalities or privileging one group over another, which in turn has implications for the risk of atrocity crimes. We've seen what happens when these risks are ignored in the interest of other agendas, whether democracy promotion, development, etc. And I think the slaughter of the Rohingya in Myanmar is perhaps the most stark example of this. This is not to say that these other agendas are not important. Of course they are. And they can be the cornerstone of what has come to be known as upstream prevention. As a case in point, this year's Secretary General's report on the responsibility to protect focuses on the role of women in and atrocity crimes. The report explores the linkages between atrocity prevention and the gender equality and women, peace and security agendas. It looks both at the serious impacts that atrocity crimes can have on women and girls, but more importantly, it underscores that women must be part of the solution through their contributions to early warning, conflict resolution, peace operations, peace building, and justice and accountability. To give but one example, we know that the presence of women peacekeepers increases the likelihood of local women reporting instances of sexual violence, which can not only themselves constitute atrocity crimes, but can also be a precursor or an early warning to other atrocity crimes, including genocide. So these agendas can and should be mutually reinforcing. Finally, I want to end with a development that I've witnessed over the past 2 years in my role as special advisor. While many traditional allies still purport to support the responsibility to protect, there's a level of caution or skepticism with regards to it, including using the term. Now, while what lies at the heart of the responsibility to protect is preventing and responding to atrocity crimes, and it therefore matters less what we call it if we do it, we cannot ignore the fact that this was a political commitment made by all states in 2005. And not reminding them of it gives way to those who, in the words of Nelson Mandela with reference to Africa, said, and I quote, "Abuse the concept of national sovereignty to deny the rest of the continent the right and duty to intervene when behind those sovereign boundaries people are being slaughtered to protect tyranny." Finally, I often get the question, how can the UN do more to prevent atrocity crimes? Now, while this is an important question, I want us to remember that the UN is an intergovernmental organization consisting of member states, and that it was states who made the commitment in 2005. The UN can assist in carrying out this promise, but it cannot do so alone. It's up to all of us, in whatever capacity, also as individuals, to ask ourselves what we can do to put an end to the most gross violations of human rights. Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing this discussion in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Karen, for these inspiring thoughts. Karen and Jan will return to answer questions together with 3 more guests. And prior to the Q&A segment, we have asked them to give some introductory remarks. First of them is Ulf Melgaard, who is the Danish focal point for R2p in his capacity as Director of the Department of International Law and Human Rights at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Ulf.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the host for organizing this event. I mean, I think there are many sad things about the current situation globally when it comes to COVID-19, but the fact that it leads us to having this conversation across several continents and cities and participants without any global footprint and easy access for everyone is, I think, encouraging and extremely inspiring to hear both from Jan Eliasson outlining the background negotiations and elevator pitches that he had to carry out in order to have the genesis or birth of the R2p concept, and Karen Smith, I think, for outlining excellently some of the challenges and main focuses that we need to have. I thought maybe my contribution today could be to give you an insight in how in everyday diplomacy does R2p play out, at least from the point of view of a Danish diplomat and being part of a foreign ministry and foreign policy that keeps the rule of law and the responsibility to protect at the very heart of what we do in international relations. I think it was I was briefly introduced as the R2p Focal Point, and some might ask, what is that all about? And just to give you a quick insight in what that means, I think almost a decade ago, we thought that one vehicle for putting some more flesh on the bone on what is R2p and increasing the implementation, we established a global network of R2p focal points across continents. And currently we have over 50 countries that have appointed such a global focal point for R2p. And the idea is to have a single entry point in every country on R2p related matters, and having one person who kind of can oversee or assist in having coordination in implementing R2p. And we have been part of building this global network, and I am, when it comes to Denmark, I have the privilege of being the R2p focal point. It was originally placed in the legal department or legal service in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs because there was a need of clarity on legal aspects of the concept. But these days, of course, implementation of R2p is much more integrated in other areas such as development and security policy. And that leads me to my second point, because I wanted to mention a bit on how we go about working with R2p internally. And we do that in the form that we try to integrate R2p in our everyday development cooperation. We have held 2 workshops in Africa and Southeast Asia to bring together experts on R2p and development experts from our embassies to see how we can use R2p in our development programs. Also in South Sudan and Myanmar, we see examples, unfortunately, that development assistance is not in itself preventing mass atrocities. Besides development cooperation, we really need also trying to integrate R2p into other areas, and we try to do that, for example, through the current Danish membership of the UN Human Rights Council, and as co-chairs in New York of the group of friends of R2p. I may be able to revert to some of these examples in our questions and answer session later. But I think what we have tried to do, and you would see that over the summer, those of you following the workings of the Human Rights Council, is that we managed to have the first R2p resolution adopted in the Human Rights Council. I mean, I think it speaks a bit to what Eliasson mentioned, was anchoring the concept of R2p. Then thirdly, I'd like to mention a bit on how we work with the specific country situations. At least I can just indicate a couple of them, because unfortunately R2p is relevant in many country situations around the world, especially because R2p is not about prevention, which means that you have to that R2p is about prevention, and it means that you need to integrate the concept early on in your programmatic work. And therefore, of course, I mean, when you are a diplomat, you of course try to build on where you have engaged previously and where you have strong links, and we have done so in implementing R2p. And just a few examples is that when the Danish government decided to assist the Iraqi government in fighting ISIS, one of the stated aims was to support the Iraqi government in protecting the population against atrocity crimes committed by the ISIS. So that's maybe the sharp end of the concept, if you so will. In Ghana, on the other hand, we have worked very closely with Kofi Annan Peacekeeping Center on training military and security actors in atrocity prevention. And in the case of Myanmar, our embassy has been closely engaged with the Annan Commission on how to address the situation of the Rohingya in Rakhine. And after the atrocities in 2017, we have supported the establishment of an accountability mechanism, which I think was adopted in 2018. Maybe one last example I'll just mention is that in Tanzania, we look at early prevention as part of the preparation of a new country program there. But just keeping an eye on my watch, it seems maybe I've exhausted the few minutes I was given. I'd be happy, of course, to engage in a discussion and look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulf. Next up is Anjali Manivanan. Two of our hosts, UNA Sweden and UNA Denmark, are longtime members of the International Coalition of the Responsibility to Protect, a coalition of civil society organizations the world over, which Anjali and the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy coordinates. We have asked Anjali to feel free to speak in her personal capacity.
Thank you, Jens, and to the UNAs of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden for inviting my participation. I'm very honored to represent global civil society on this panel of esteemed speakers with all of you. I'll use the next few minutes, I think, to overview some of the work done by civil society. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with the work of ICR2p or various R2p focused organizations, but in case you aren't, I thought this would be helpful to give, I suppose, a bit of a taste of what role civil society can and has played with respect to the responsibility to protect. So ICR2p, the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, is a global network of civil society organizations that are dedicated to advancing R2p. And this coalition has amplified the voice and power of civil society members to address mass atrocities through this advancement of R2p since January 2009. We have members from every region and working on a wide range of sectors, including women's rights, conflict prevention, human rights, justice, and humanitarian service delivery. As part of the coalition, ICR2p members undertake advocacy and capacity building in order to prevent and halt mass atrocity crimes. The ICR2p and its members publish papers, toolkits, including a toolkit that we have to help understand R2p and various actors' roles, and also listing examples and case studies of situation countries, as well as other educational documents. ICR2p has also conducted workshops and conferences for a wide range of actors, again, diplomats, UN and regional officials, parliamentarians, academics, media, and even other civil society. And while the ICR2p Secretariat, who I represent, undertakes activities on behalf of the coalition and in partnership with members, it also acts as an information hub to share such publications and events. We do so by maintaining different information and social media channels that we use to update our membership and other partners on country situations, or say if there are sign-ons or letters that are going to policymakers. We also assist in research and facilitate communication and collaboration between civil society actors or other bodies as relevant. And in recent years, I think the ICR2p has really strengthened its focus on cross-cutting issues such as meaningful gender inclusion, which I think is particularly relevant due to some of the remarks on women, peace, and security. And since I joined the organization only in August of last year, so while I have been in the human rights space and familiar with the R2p space, I'm coming at it a bit, I guess, in a more recent context, perhaps focusing specifically on R2p. There's been recent success in convening introductory trainings on R2p and more broadly, atrocity prevention. And in the COVID era, we've been able to go virtual, and we'll still be hosting trainings with our members and civil society organizations around the world. Also trying to engage other stakeholders to form these multi-stakeholder collaborations in discussions on R2p, as well as its intersection with other relevant thematic agendas, including gender, youth, disarmament, peace building, and the SDGs. I think the linkages between R2p and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda are particularly important as we enter the 20th anniversary of that agenda's existence. So the historic significance of the World Summit outcome document and the unanimous state endorsement of R2p 15 years ago cannot be understated. In the years since, however, there is still much to do, and R2p as an idea has really suffered, particularly in the aftermath of the international community's response to the situation in Libya in 2011. And this has led, as many of you likely know already, to a misunderstanding that R2p is synonymous with military intervention and regime change, and thus overlooking the range of peaceful measures that must come first under Pillar 3 of R2p. And Libya's legacy has been an excuse for third-party states to fail, I think, in their responsibility to protect populations when the host state is the violator. And so this has resulted in seeing the mass atrocity situations in the Syrias and the Myanmars of the world continue unabated. I think to close, I think the question we're all wondering in this 15th anniversary year is, where do we go from here? I think there is an urgent need to correct some of these common misconceptions about R2p. No, R2p is not the same as humanitarian or military intervention. No, R2p cannot be used just as a vehicle for regime change. And no, the international community's R2p is more than just the use of force. In fact, the use of force is not the first step under Pillar 3. Unfortunately, R2p may become increasingly toothless until states who are the primary bearers of R2p and the building blocks of the international community revert to their original understanding of R2p 15 years ago and pre-Libya. I want to thank you again for this opportunity, and I welcome the dialogue and questions to follow shortly.
Thanks, Anjali. This summer, Norway was elected to sit on the UN Security Council. And as you understand, many of the conflicts and topics and dilemmas concerning the R2p complex are or should be of concern to the UN Security Council. We are happy to have Tor Henrik Andersen, a senior advisor on UN policy at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, joining us at this panel. Please share some thoughts with us, Tor Henrik.
Thank you so much. First, thanks to the UN associations for convening this meeting and to the previous speakers for their interventions. Let me first start by confirming that Norway continues to be firmly committed to the responsibility to protect, as we have been since these principles were adopted at the UN World Summit in 2005. We're part of the group of friends of R2p in Geneva, and we have held Nordic statements on R2p in the General Assembly at the UN and the Security Council for the last 10 to 15 years. The world needs more international cooperation, and we're convinced that upholding a collective responsibility to protect must remain at the center of our commitment to an international rules-based order. Hence, we must increase efforts to move towards a prevention-centered analysis, as well as a culture of earlier prevention action when signs of atrocities, crimes, are identified. Prevention remains at the core of all three pillars as Karen stated, of the responsibility to protect, not only the third pillar, which maybe unfortunately has been the pillar most strongly associated with R2p. As you all know, and as Jan now stated, we have been elected a member of the Security Council starting January next year. And we're both humble and grateful to have been given this vote of confidence, and we're now preparing for the task. A lot of what goes on in the Security Council is country situations. And in addressing country situations on the Council agenda, respect for international law, including human rights and international humanitarian law, will be our main guideline. In addition, we have decided to have 4 thematic areas that will underpin our work. The first one is peace diplomacy. The second one is inclusion of women, including the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The third one is protection of civilians, including children. And the fourth one is climate change and security. All agendas that has a preventive agenda in it, I would say. The Security Council has a clear and detailed mandate for prevention and the peaceful resolution of dispute, as stated in Chapter 6. Unfortunately, the Council clearly underperforms in this field of preventive diplomacy. Norway has a long tradition for peace diplomacy, and as a member of the UN Security Council, we want to use our experience, knowledge, and network in this area to strengthen this agenda, and by that, the Council prevention and conflict resolution efforts. Investment in early warning and preventive diplomacy can help diffuse tension and bring the parties together for peaceful settlement before conflict erupts. This is fully in line with the first and the second pillar of R2p. Initiatives like horizon scanning and more recent, such as informal situational awareness briefings, are positive, but still the Council primarily engages only after conflict has erupted. Obviously, geopolitical dynamics and political sensitivity among member states makes early warning and early action more difficult. But we believe that there are still untapped opportunities. In our view, the Secretary General can do more to engage in preventive diplomacy through his good offices and in accordance with Article 99 of the Charter. The links between the Council and the Peacebuilding Commission should continue to be reinforced. And another idea is looking into how the Council can benefit better from the combined resources of the new generation of resident coordinators and the UN country teams, which should make the UN more sensitive and agile when conflict threatens to erupt, such as, for example, during electoral campaigns. I would also like to mention that Norway, as a member of the Accountable, Coherent and Transparent group called ACT in the UN, was part of the core group that drafted and championed the Code of Conduct against atrocity crimes. The strength of the Code of Conduct is the responsibility of each of the signatories, either as permanent or elected member. And it states that we have called on permanent members of the Security Council to hold their vetoes, not vote against a credible draft resolution before the Security Council on timely and decisive action to end the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or to prevent such crimes. And this will also guide us as an elected member. In all of this work, we need to continue linking R2p to other related agendas, including peacekeeping, protection of civilians, women, peace and security, sustaining peace, and sustainable development goals. And finally, I would also like to mention the important role of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council play in responding to atrocity crimes. In the 15 years since adoption of responsibility to protect, there has been a growing consensus among states, the wider UN system and other stakeholders that human rights mechanisms play a key role in implementing R2p. Treaty bodies, special procedure mandate holders, and the universal periodic reviews are all uniquely suited to strengthen atrocity prevention and response. Ensuring accountability remains one of the most effective ways to prevent the recurrence of mass atrocity crimes, and this will be on our agenda for our 2 years in the Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor Henrik. that concludes our speakers, and we are into the questions and answers section. And as expected, we have several questions, a whole range of them. And we will start with a short one from Ingeborg Breines in Norway, and I'll ask it myself. She wonders, and I have also myself wondered, what's the Scandinavian translation of atrocity crimes? Now we have three experts here, Jan, Ulf, and Tor Henrik, who could finally give us an answer. How do you define atrocity crimes in Swedish? Or Norwegian, or Danish? Microphone, please. Tor Henrik, I think, wants to go first. I can't hear you, Tor Henrik. No, try again.
Sorry. I'm not sure what the correct Norwegian translation to atrocity crimes is. Maybe we could have one of the others who are more expert on it. Ulf, maybe.
What do you say, Ulf? Could you give us an answer?
I mean, for historic reasons, the Norwegian and the Danish languages are very similar. And unfortunately, in Danish, we do not have a set phrase either, but we usually refer to it as serious international crimes or alvorlige internationale forbrydelser.
Or Jan, are the Swedes more developed than the Danes and the Norwegians? Do we have a word ourselves?
Well, I negotiated in English, so,
so no way.
Brainwashed from that.
I've struggled.
You know it when you see it.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. You know what atrocity crimes are when you see them.
Genocide, war, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. That's the ICC language also.
Yeah, det grövsta av krigsförbrytelser, I usually say when I try to.
Why didn't you say that from the beginning? That's good.
Yeah.
Eller grusomhet mot mänskligheten kan man ju översätta det direkt.
Yep. Now we have a completely other question. We will invite Ås Alko-Haili to join us with a question. I apologize that I cannot pronounce your name correctly.
Yes, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And my name is pronounced Ås Alko-Haili. It's kind of a tongue twister. Thank you so much for the panel, for sharing your opinions and your what's it called? Oh, never mind. So my question is, what are the diplomatic and humanitarian challenges against non-state actors, for example, ISIS, in relations to responsibility to protect, or is the R2p's function only effective in regards to state responsibility?
Would we see if Karen perhaps could answer this one? Is the R2p function only possible towards state responsibility, or could you use it in the ISIL segment? And Ulf also wants to say something on this one. Karen, please.
Sure, maybe I'll just be very quick. I also took note of a number of questions in the Q&A, on the screen, so maybe I can touch on some of those as well. But yeah, with regards to this question, I think this is always a big legal question. I'm not an international lawyer, but of course there's always the question about what do you do with non-state actors who haven't signed up to international treaties, for example. So does it apply to them? And I think with regards to R2p, as I said earlier, it is very, very state-centered or state-focused. But part of that, means that states have the responsibility to protect people within their populations, within their territories, and also to protect them from non-state actors, such as ISIS, for example. Now, I think, so of course, ISIS or the Islamic State would aspires, I think, to be regarded as a state and to be recognized as such. They haven't yet been, which means they cannot be held accountable or they don't necessarily recognize international law to the same extent. That doesn't mean that they can't be held accountable for atrocity crimes committed, right? So we now see there are a number of initiatives underway to hold atrocity crimes committed by Daesh accountable in places like Syria, for example. So I think this is really important that, that international law exists. And I'm not going to go into the legal aspects of that. I think maybe Ulf has more to say about that, being the legal expert on the panel. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Ulf, the floor is yours.
No, thank you. I'm afraid I do not have much to add on the very fine remarks that Karen Smith just provided. That I think we would see that every state has the responsibility to prevent from threats arising or deriving from non-state actors such as ISIL, but that would be a state obligation, and in that also, of course, there would be an obligation for the international community to assist any host state in addressing that threat for mass atrocity crimes that would come from a non-state actor. So I think that's the answer as far as R2p goes. In isolation, that is a state concept, but also from threats deriving from non-state actors. Then there would be other crimes under international humanitarian law that would bind also a non-state actor, but that's a different question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ulf. And we will move to, I hope, Juliette Pove. Not really sure how to pronounce your name, but I know you very well because you are from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Here we are.
Hi, Jens. Yes, good to see you all, and thanks so much for organizing this very interesting event. So Jens already introduced me. My name is Juliette. I'm from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect in New York. And my question is to all panelists, like, where would you like to see, or where do you see the discussion on R2p in 5 years when we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the World Summit? And what role can civil society play in this regard? Thank you.
I think Jan and Tor Henrik were the first to wave. So Jan, I give it to you first.
Well, I think it is very important that everybody recognizes that the R2p is a tool, a very important tool in the area of peace and security, but also in the area of human rights and development. And I recall another feature that I'm very proud of from the summit document in 2005, and that is the formula that in the preamble brings together peace, development, human rights, where we say there is no peace without development, but there is no development without peace, and none of the above without respect of human rights. So we put on the same level of importance these three areas and show the interrelationship between the three and how they mutually reinforce each other. And I hope that we have adopted in 5 years' time a more horizontal approach. It is recognized in the area of peace building and the sustaining peace concept. But I think we need more and more to see that we cannot talk about security in military terms only. We need to bring in other elements, like our Norwegian colleague was mentioning, peace and security and development and climate change. And we need to see this broader definition of security and use R2p in all areas. And above all, adopt from the very beginning a preventive approach. The first question is always, what should be done to prevent what we feel is happening? The vibrations that we hear, we should act at the vibration stage, not at the stage where the house is on fire. I was chairing the work also for another concept which we haven't mentioned, but I spent 2 or 3 years working on it, namely the human rights up front. We wanted to see human rights violations as a first sign of a conflict coming up, and that the Security Council should act already on the human rights violation stage and see it as a warning about what may come. We are meeting a bit of resistance on that concept, but I hope that human rights up front will also be used in the future, even if it doesn't have the same recognition as R2p, which is part of a summit document.
Thanks, John.
As civil society, crucial, of course, because the horizontal approach means also they are actors. We cannot reach any results if we don't see the role of governments, of course, and the international organizations, parliaments, the private sector, the academic world, and the people. Remember the first 3 words of the Charter. I always have it at my desk here. The first 3 words of the Charter is "we the peoples." That's where we are accountable to the peoples. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Tor Henrik and perhaps also Angie, any views on R2p in 5 years from now? Of these 5 years, 2 are under Norwegian Security Councilship.
Thank you. I think at the core of R2p is prevention agenda. And I think that what we will see in the coming years is that the prevention agenda is going to be lifted also in the Security Council and at the UN. And I think there are 2 main reasons for that. One is the humanitarian costs of conflict. Everyone agrees on the humanitarian cost, and the connection between the security agenda and the development agenda becomes more evident. The other is the financial cost of cleaning up after conflict, which is costing the international community, and not at least the countries who are experiencing conflict, but also the international community and the UN, enormous financial costs. And these are financial resources that are becoming more and more scarce, and that could be used in a much more fruitful way if they could be used in a preventive part of the agenda. And this is an awareness that we also see that are being more and more raised. So I hope that we will see a focus when it comes to the UN and Security Council, not only on chapters 7, but also on all the possibilities in chapter 6. And I agree with Jan Eliasson that we will also see a wider focus on the security agenda, looking at the root causes of conflict. And if you look at the root causes of conflict, then the involvement of women, the involvement of youth, climate change comes up as areas that are closely connected to the prevention agenda. And I also see that these agendas are on the rise, both in the General Assembly, but also in the Security Council, although there are big differences between the different member countries of the Security Council on these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Anjali.
Yes, thank you for that question, Juliet. I think for me, and I think I'm just speaking in my personal capacity and maybe not necessarily on behalf of the coalition, but I'd certainly like to see us get to a place where we're no longer justifying what the importance of R2p is. I feel like many of the discussions I have, even with civil society, they begin with this question of, okay, well, what about Libya, and these misunderstandings, that we can actually go back to what is the heart and soul of R2p. So in some ways, in 5 years, I hope that we're, as far as the R2p discussion is concerned, 20 years ago, that we're back when there was this unanimous endorsement and there was actual strong support, and not this sort of skepticism that's been described by some of the panelists. I think also I would hope to see, I think within the UN system anyway, a better understanding of how and this goes to Jan's comment about human rights up front. So my family is actually from Sri Lanka, and again, speaking in a personal capacity. So in that respect, I want to see there actually be real cohesion within the UN system, as we've seen this kind of systemic failure that had occurred and was found in Sri Lanka, that was then identified as the more or less same situation that happened in Myanmar. And I think that is also that's a very important aspect and an important key player. And so I would hope to see that where those discussions take place, that there is actual integration and communication where there are serious human rights violations happening and risks of mass atrocities or atrocities already occurring.
Thanks, Angie. If I may, I would like to say something myself here too. hearing what you say about prevention and hearing what you say about women, peace and security and the link to R2p, wouldn't it make sense to more often speak about R2p, the softer side, for instance, atrocity crime prevention? Wouldn't it make sense that when we speak about prevention of violent conflicts, sustaining peace, women, peace and security, etc., also more often remember to include references to R2p? I think you have something, Karen. You are the principal writer for the Secretary General's report on R2p, which this year is on the theme of R2p and the link to women, peace and security. And you say that R2p focal points should more often speak about the link to women, peace and security. But shouldn't it also be the other way around? When we talk about women, peace and security, shouldn't we remember to include the reference to R2p, perhaps mainly directed to you, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be very happy to hear the others' views on this as well, but I absolutely agree. I think, and I think we know what the reasons are. There is this kind of resistance to, towards having an agenda which people feel kind of protective or defensive of in some way, being somehow tarnished by what they see as, R2p, which can be politically quite sensitive or even controversial, which I think is really a pity. And it goes back to what Angie just said and what I mentioned earlier as well, is, these persistent misconceptions about what R2p is and what its value is actually, as Jan and others have pointed out as well, as a tool. So I think, more work needs to be done, and this is what we're doing. This is a large part of what my office is doing as well, is really to show and try to explain to people within the UN system and outside of it the value added of the responsibility to protect as well. So, the value added of looking at things through this, what we call an atrocity prevention lens. And I think, to take the women and peace and security agenda as an example, or even the broader kind of women's rights agenda. If you think of the Secretary General has a big emphasis on increasing women's equality. And if you think about that, it's not just about that being an important issue in itself, but we know that in countries where there's high levels of discrimination against women, there's high levels of gender and sexual-based violence, that is one of the irrefutable risk signs for the potential of atrocity commission, being committed. So it almost strengthens the argument for why it is so essential for us to pay attention to women's rights as an important part of human rights more generally. So yeah, I think this, and it's about having this discussion and making R2p less scary, I want to say, and really talking about how these different agendas can be mutually reinforcing.
If I can just add something to that, I also think, at least within civil society actors who are in different fields, and most of them are not in a field that specifically they describe as R2p, they don't necessarily understand how what they're working on, whether it's protection of civilians or women, peace and security issues, has a connection to R2p. So I think that's also important to make sure that, I think it's something that civil society can do as well, is to just point out what these linkages are in a clear and I think easy to understand way, because I think that many people are out there and they're doing R2p type work, but they have no idea. And it could just be that they maybe don't even understand R2p, aside from the political issues that exist, because it's just a doctrine that they weren't encountering previously. So I think that's also important.
Ulf or Tor Henrik, is this something that you could bring back to your ministries to see if they can speak about R2p when they speak about the softer sides of issues?
If I can maybe jump in with just one more comment about that. I think, besides the fact that these agendas are mutually reinforcing, I think it's also important to highlight, what makes R2p different. And so often I hear the argument, well, we're already doing conflict prevention, so why do we need to bring in atrocity prevention as well? Isn't it covered? And that's where you then need to understand that there are actually differences between those two as well. Like, when you're preventing conflict or you're trying to, mediate between different parts of a conflict, the tools that you use are different from the ones where there are clear perpetrators and clear victims, which is often the case with you know, the commission of atrocities. So also take into account that, you know, that's why you have to include this atrocity prevention lens in whether you are already doing conflict prevention and you have a, you know, an early warning system for conflict, which the European Union has, the African Union has, but trying to say that within that you need to focus on atrocity prevention because it's slightly different.
Yeah, to Henrik.
Yeah, I think Ulf raised his hand, but I can start. I agree with Karen that there is a development here. That it's more, if you could look at it as a timeline, where you have preventive actions at several stages during the evolvement of a conflict, which may lead into atrocities. And of course, human rights violation often is a very early sign of something developing, and which needs special attention and also needs special tools and actions taken. But when they fail to work, either because there is no political will within the sovereign state to protect its own, or there is no ability within the state to protect its own population, then you move into a new step where you maybe need different tools. And I think it's a bit unfortunate that we have come into a situation where R2p is not longer articulated in the way it was 15 years ago. And I think maybe, I mean, there are probably several reasons for that, but the developments in Libya and the situation, what happened in Libya, probably also has caused a certain reluctance among several countries to use the term or the principles behind R2p as such. And that's a bit unfortunate because the agenda as such is extremely important.
Thanks, Ulf.
Thank you. I know if I may just go back to the question that was asked earlier on where would we like to see R2p in 5 years' time, and I think my Norwegian colleague has maybe taken us in that direction already, but I think we have a very fine normative framework around R2p right now. We know what it's about. We know the different pillars. We have had a lot of discussion around that. So I think maybe there's not a need for a whole lot of new inventions on the normative side. I think there is a need to keep R2p alive as a concept and as a focus on preventing these mass atrocity crimes and keeping that commitment on the agenda and holding countries and international society accountable. And then there was a question, and basically that's what I would like to see happen in 5 years' time, is that we become much better at translating the normative framework into steps in everyday life and diplomacy and work at country level that would increase our ability to prevent these crimes. And then there was a question: could we ask? I asked my minister to do more of R2p or to have a better interrelationship between R2p and other policy areas. And I think actually that's kicking in an open door, because we do that already. We try to integrate R2p all the places relevant in what we do. I mean, I think I presented a couple of the examples in my introductory remarks, but I think the other issue that came up on the interlinkage between R2p and gender equality and engagement of women is very important, and that's one thing that we also try to push from a Danish side. Also in my department, we have a special envoy for the freedom of religion and belief, and we try to push also R2p and the prevention agenda also in the diplomacy we do on freedom of religion and belief. And I think we talked a bit about the issue of Myanmar, and you could name a couple of other examples where there has indeed been a very strong a component in the conflict that related to frictions between different religious groups, and there I think is another issue where we do need to do more. And then I think we had both, I think Eliasson and Smith and my Norwegian friend who also highlighted the importance of having a stronger connection between R2p and whatever we do on the human rights agenda. And that's one thing I share completely. And as mentioned, as current member of the UN Human Rights Council, that's one thing we push. And I mentioned the new and first resolution we had on R2p in the council adopted this summer, but also when addressing country situation of serious human rights violations at a country level, we try to keep a focus on prevention and holding the countries accountable. So with that, of course, I also agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulf. We have to move on to more questions. We won't be able to answer all, I'm afraid, but we will have a couple of more, I think. And next one to speak is Kenneth Christie, whom I think is a Canadian academic. Are you there, Kenneth?
Yes, I am. I can't have my video on at the moment for some technical reason, but I can certainly ask my question. And the question I wanted to ask was that there have been a lot of criticisms of R2p under the guise that interventions under R2p are selective and based on preconceived strategic interests rather than genuine humanitarian grounds. And I think Alex Bellamy, who's written a lot about R2p, has made these kinds of criticisms that we're not doing enough on prevention, and we're certainly not doing enough on restoring these countries after R2p has taken place. So I was wondering if you could comment on these kinds of criticisms.
Thank you, Kenneth. Who would like to go first? Are interventions selective and based on preconceived strategic questions rather than genuine humanitarian grounds? I see that we have some other questions also in the line of can R2p be misused? That could perhaps be in the same spectrum of questions. Who would like to go first? I see.
Karen should work, and then I'm ready after
Karen first, and then John.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say that I feel this is a question that we should leave to the current and former diplomats, to answer. But of course, my quick answer would be, of course, any kind of principle has the potential to be misused. This is, we're talking about an imperfect world. We're talking about a world in which states have interests and they have geopolitical interests. So I think, this is something that we need to take for granted. But I think there are ways of limiting this. And I think that was exactly what R2p was attempting to do, right? To try and respond to the criticism of humanitarian intervention, where you saw individual states or groups of states kind of taking unilateral decisions to use force under the guise often of, humanitarian concerns. So the whole idea was that, through saying this needs to be authorized by the Security Council, you would be able to limit that. Now, obviously, we saw with Libya that was not entirely possible either. So again, as I said earlier, that suggests that there need to be further guidelines, particularly with regards to holding the Security Council accountable when they authorize force. So I just wanted to say that, but then Kenneth, who I think that was a very Scottish accent. So I don't know if Kenneth is a Scot living in Canada, but he also mentioned the question of, what happens after a military intervention? And I think that's a part of the ICISS report that was kind of lost in the subsequent discussion, the issue of rebuilding, which was initially seen as kind of the third pillar of R2p. So that, yes, when there is action by the international community, which may take the form of military action, that there should be a plan in place for what do we do afterwards? How do we rebuild? And so I'll leave that at that, but I look forward to hearing what the others have to say.
John?
Well, I remember when we discussed how this would be used and avoid this landing in the humanitarian intervention, l'ingérence humanitaire, as the French called it, Bernard Kouchner and others, was that we want to sort of send the message that solidarity must not end at a border, but end at people in need. And that was sort of the basic idea, that when you see these atrocity crimes being committed, we should take away that sharp border. And that's where this sovereignty discussion came up. I'm not so much worried for political reasons about whether this is going to be misused by major powers, because if they are suspicious of each other, they will stop action in the Security Council. If one, let's say United States has one view and then Russia and China another, they will cross each other out, and we will land at the usual thing that nothing will happen. But I think we should keep that in mind. That's what it's all about. It's human beings in need. And the problems that I think we have today basically is the mistrust that exists in a broad sense across the board, in regions and among major powers. And if that mistrust is as deep as it is now, we will have a wall of resistance to everything we do. And that's why we need to be very concrete and hands-on to bring in the the utility of acting early for reasons not only of suffering of people, but of money and the reputation of the United Nations, which actually should affect everybody. So the trust factor is important. That's why we need to bring in the concept everywhere as much as we can. I'm glad we brought in another negotiation in which I was involved as Deputy Secretary General. We brought in goal number 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have peaceful societies, we have the rule of law, and we have well-functioning institutions. So this horizontal approach is there, and the R2p is part of that aspect also. So the broader we look at security, and the broader and more concretely we define the challenges and find pragmatic solutions to the problems we have, the better it would be. Because if we bring it to the level of humanitarian intervention with the interests of major powers, we're lost.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we have a question here from Anna Arriba Sebastian. Would you like to pose your question yourself, Anna?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, could you speak up a little bit more?
Okay, hi, good afternoon. It's Anna from Spain, and I'm a student at Aalborg University. As Karen mentioned, the hate speech as a previous stage that we have to prevent in order to avoid these crimes worldwide. And as many political parties now use this speech and are getting more and more support in the global north, I wonder what can be done to defend the principle of responsibility to protect in democratic systems where these parties are getting into the government. Thank you.
A question more about the situation in Western Europe. Who would like to? Ulf.
No, I was delighted about this question because it leads me to speak a bit of my job as a focal point on R2p in Denmark, because I think as the student here rightly said, I mean, what's the meaning of R2p in maybe our part of the world, and I mean, we have come to realize that, of course, the threats for mass atrocity prevention in Denmark would be quite different from some of the country situation that we have discussed today. But it doesn't mean that there's no risk. It may be that the risk is only something that we could foresee in a future which is more distant, and it may be that it would take other form. But I think it's right to say that, of course, issues such as anti-Semitism and right extremism or what have you, that would try to demonize only one part of the population, could be seen as something which down the road could lead into these mass atrocity crimes. So one of my tasks as a focal point in Denmark has been, of course, to be part of work ongoing in Denmark. And I can say, for example, that we are currently drawing up a national action plan on the prevention of anti-Semitism, which we see as part of the R2p agenda in our country. So I think the question here asked is spot on, that it's not only something for certain categories of country. It is something which is relevant to all of us, though of course relevant in a different way, and we need to make a thorough analysis on how we can best take part in work of prevention. So thank you for the question, and just to provide an example on exactly on that, on how we try to address dangers that may come from, for instance, the far right. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulf, and I see that the rest of the panel is nodding, so I think that we all agree with your answer. So we may be able to squeeze in one more question, a final question, and it feels quite fair that it goes to a person from UNA Denmark, Louise Martin Osenkrupp. Louise, you have also helped me a little bit with arranging this thing, so I could say thank you as well.
Well, thank you, Jens. You have done a great job as facilitating the discussion, so a big thanks to you. And in general to the panelists, I was very happy about all your discussions or your comments, and particularly Karen's comment about that the work starts at home. And now I cannot see my question any longer, Jens, but so you might have to help me. But I was very inspiring by the comment that starts from home, and particularly asking critical questions when you give development assistance. And I was wondering if that could also be incorporated in both maybe Norway's, Sweden's, and Denmark's plans for action plans for incorporating R2p in national policies. I really think it's a general valid comment that and something that could work as a default when incorporating R2p in national policies. So that was just a short question from me. And thank you once again for contributing to this discussion and celebrating the 15th year of R2p.
Thanks, Louise. So could we incorporate R2p questions when giving development assistance? This will be we can see if we can have some short remarks from each and every one of you who would like to, and that will end the whole webinar. Would Karen like to go first?
Sure. I don't feel like I want to be giving policy advice to states, but absolutely. As I mentioned, I think it's important, and this is also the idea behind the R2p Focal Point. That's the one person who, whether it has to do with development assistance or anything else, is always asking the question: what are the implications here potentially for increasing the risk of atrocity crimes? And so that has to do more with. So I think Louise's question was partly about looking kind of inward domestically, but then the second part was more about dealings with other states. So I think in terms of foreign policy in particular, it's about how your interactions with other states could potentially increase the risk of atrocity crimes, and just taking that into account. And perhaps I just wanted to say very briefly as well too, I think Anna's question was an important one. What can we do in states where in Europe where we see the rise of right-wing parties particularly coming to power? I think it's a huge concern when we see especially leaders using hate speech and using incitement to hate speech, or at least not speaking out about it. So I think again here the responsibility falls to ordinary people, to civil society organizations, to saying we don't want people like that in government. We don't want people like that. It's not okay in democratic societies for that to happen. And so but also just to students, I want to say that you can play a role in your own, capacity as an individual. Students are very much online. They're very much engaged in social media. It's about speaking out when you see intolerance, when you see hate speech. and countering that, not just by saying this is bad, but countering that by positive counter narratives, by, you know, positive speak. I think that is really at the heart of all of this. So I'll end my comments there, but thank you again for everyone for participating. I've learned a lot.
Thanks, Karen. Tor Henrik has waved.
Yeah, I think I concur with that, absolutely. And I think, as it said previously, it starts at home. I think all countries has a responsibility to go through their own policies, and also how they perform their own policies, how their leaders talk to make sure that that they follow the policies that they are aligned with internationally, very much so. But I also think that one thing we have not discussed today so much is how can we assist states in building the necessary capacity to be able to do work at home. Because at one stage it has to do with the political will within the state, but it also has to do with the capacity. And I think we could do more, both from a UN perspective and from a human rights perspective, to do capacity building in states so that they're able to do more themselves, and we don't need to move into pillar 3 of R2p, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor Henrik. And one might remember that the Peace Building Fund was created in the very same decision as the R2p concept. Jan, any final thoughts?
Well, on the development issues, we see more and more the use of conditionality. Normally, I'm not in favor of conditionality generally, but I think when it comes to insisting on respect of human rights for development assistance, I think it's absolutely correct, because we have to translate our own values to how taxpayers' money is used and send a message of what we stand for. But I think a more serious basic issue now is this thing that you all came in very strongly in the end here. I'm very grateful for that. That we, in today's world, have to watch out very carefully what's happening now inside our own countries. The polarization that goes on inside nations mainly, and with different political forces with a bitterness which enters the area of hate speech, and where violence is around the corner, then I think there is a need for us to come back to basic values and basic agreements and basic conventions that we have agreed upon. I feel, having worked as Under Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs and most recently in the UN as DSG, that there is a lack of knowledge of international conventions. People don't know well enough about human rights Declaration of 48. They don't even know the UN Charter of 45. They don't know, well, the 1951 Refugee Convention and so forth. We need to, and they definitely don't know R2p as much as we would like to do, although it was adopted unanimously by member states. And we need to really wave those flags in front of people. Here we are, and this is a great tool for us to maintain our human dignity. We are sliding right now, and these other forces are very strong, and they use all new methods to divide us and successfully, politically, sell these ideas. And therefore, this discussion, I think, takes on to me a wider significance, that we have to really stand up for international cooperation, stand up for mobilizing all the good forces. And the good forces that are, I believe in very strongly, are for women, youth, education, and international cooperation.
Thank you, Jan. Ulf and Angie, we are running a little bit late, but perhaps you would like to have some final words.
I can go. I think as Tor Henrik, you reminded me with your comment about needing more discussions on assistance, and I think that kind of also raises I think this issue that pillar 2 is, I find anyways, the least discussed and explored pillar, even though at least for civil society, I think there's a pretty clear role that civil society plays there. But I think most of the discussions and debates around R2p, they're around pillar 3, but then there's also a big focus on pillar 1 and not as much on pillar 2. So I think I would just maybe revisit the question about discussions of R2p in the future and how that pillar also needs to get its due consideration. On the note of development, I think if I can just take it in a slightly different direction, which is all about civil society fundraising and the terminology that civil society has to use to access certain spaces. I think funders, and by funders I also mean state and government funders, are who, you know, claim to support R2p are maybe not as R2p friendly when they see the language in a certain document. And so actually one of the strategies that ICR2p is employing is to use this language of atrocity prevention to get our foot in the door, because that's easier. And then when you get the money, you have trainings that focus on R2p. But there's this divide between, you know, I mean, if there's no money for it, then civil society is unable to promote it and to promote it openly. So I think that's just maybe a final remark and a struggle that I'm sure other NGOs have encountered, and with you know, some diplomats around and maybe others who are state representatives in the audience, I thought it would be worth flagging this. And finally, to just say thank you again for this opportunity. It was a really great, informative panel with some really good questions coming from the audience. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Angie. Any final comments from Ulf?
No, I think I'll try to be short, and I can subscribe to everything that has been said in this final round. And I think today, and thank you so much for organizing, that this is really also one of the things that need to be done in the promotion of R2p, having a public conversation around the subject matter, and try to brainstorm together how can we translate this into actions and keeping the agenda alive. And I think, I mean, there is a need, and I would like to underline that was brought up today, that we need to react to whenever we see hate speech. I mean, there are very few of these atrocity crimes, if any, that do not begin with some form of hate speech. We spoke earlier of Rwanda, where we saw radio waves transmitting encouragements or incitement to commit these horrendous crimes. In Myanmar, we saw Facebook used as a vehicle for just about the same thing. And I think regardless of where we are in technological development and how we communicate, there's a need that all of us react whenever we see hate speech, and that we speak out. And I agree with Karen that it's done best by countering with a positive narrative. That's probably the strongest weapon we have. So thank you very much for organizing today, and look forward to participating in discussion like this at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulf, and thank you to the whole panel for being here and celebrating this 15th birthday of R2p, and also to the audience, of course. And I wish that we will see each other again in 5 years' time, and that we have seen some progress until then. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.